الله نزل أحسن الحديث كتابا متشابها مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Welcome to another episode of Quran Circle 11, where we listen to verses of the Quran and reflect upon a topic which is women in the Quran, how they are mentioned in the Quran, and for us to benefit and for our sisters to benefit from the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes the verses are talking about something unique in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created women in certain aspects different than men, and men are different than women in certain aspects. And as we saw, that when it comes to the general rulings in the deen of Islam, they're all the same. Believing men and believing women, and what's halal, what's haram, and what made women women and what made men men, you would find very specific rulings because it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the creator of the heavens and the earth. And this is one of the miraculous things in the deen of Islam that recognizes these differences to make them live a goodly life in this life and the goodly life in the hereafter as being obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We are in Surah Yusuf, inshallah ta'ala. We'll take some of the verses in Surah Yusuf that mentions women. And as we know, the story of Yusuf alayhi salam involves this. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whenever there's a story in the Quran, what's meant by the story is for the reciter to benefit from it, is to go beyond just the actions of the story to benefit from it, of how a person can be a better person, how can we learn from it so that we are steadfast upon the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we'll start inshallah ta'ala with verse number 19 in Surah Yusuf. But before we start, I would like to introduce the reciters with us tonight. We have Sheikh Asad al-Hawi. Wa alaikum assalam wa barakatuh. Welcome to the program. And Sheikh Ahmed Rajab, barakallahu feekum, and Sheikh Ayman Abdul Mun'im. Jazakumullah khairan for coming, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you for your effort. And again, this is a recitation of the Quran from those who are, mashallah, the recitation is perfect by the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So follow the recitation, inshallah, and benefit from it, and then we'll talk briefly afterwards, inshallah. So the first part here is verses number 19 to verse number 22. in Surah Yusuf, and Sheikh Asad, go ahead and recite for us, inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. وجاءت سيارة فأرسلوا واردهم فأدلى دلوه قال يا بشرى هذا غلام وأسروه بضاعة والله عليم بما يعملون وشروه بثمن بخس دراهم معدودة وكانوا فيه من الزاهدين وقال الذي اشتراه من مصر لامرأته أكرمي مثواه عسى أن ينفعنا وقال الذي اشتراه من مصر لامرأته أكرمي مثواه عسى أن ينفعنا أو نتخذه ولدا وكذلك مكنا ليوسف في الأرض ولنعلمه من تأويل الأحاديث والله غالب على أمره ولكن أكثر الناس لا يعلمون ولما بلغ أشده آتيناه حكما وعلما ولما فلما بلغ أشده آتيناه حكما وعلما وكذلك نجزي المحسنين.
MashaAllah, barakallah feek, jazakumullah khairan. As we know that Surah Yusuf and what Yusuf alayhi salam went through, one trial after the other, and it's a story that is very comprehensive, and it's one of the miraculous ways of the Quran. The best stories are the stories mentioned in the Quran, so it involves many individuals, on one of which the women, those who came across in the story, and one of which is the wife of the Aziz, the one that was having a level of authority in Egypt at the time, the one that hosted Yusuf alayhi salam. And this is where the verses, as we heard, when Yusuf alayhi salam was found by some travelers and they sold him as a slave, and they didn't take much with regards to this. And then the one that purchased him from Misr, he said to his wife, to honor him, to take care of him, that he would benefit them or they would take him as a son. And this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala established Yusuf in the land. And it shows the importance of the women as part of the household, and they are the ones that establish things. And the tamkeen, or for Yusuf alayhi salam to be established on the earth, being taken care of, and taken care of with both the one that had him and his wife, and for the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be established, and the matter is by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No one can oppose what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed. And therefore, this is what people need to witness. And most people, they do not know that. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decrees something, He will create the means to it. So the verses, as we know, and as it's going to be mentioned inshallah ta'ala, showed that relationship between Yusuf alayhi salam and that what should be from every believer towards the temptations and towards the desires that is present in one's being. But when it comes to the obedience of Allah and to be patient with the rewards of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is what many people, they fail in such a test. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave steadfastness to Yusuf alayhi salam. So this is the first few verses here. And then when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestowed upon Yusuf his favors, and he was grew up in such an environment, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rewards those who are muhsineen, those who are good doers, by giving him the wisdom and the knowledge. Afterwards, the verses talks about the test that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made Yusuf alayhi salam face, and the fact that Yusuf alayhi salam was patient with regards to this test is far more than the patience that he received or that he acquired when he was thrown into the well. Because this is a matter of choice, whether to choose and being patient to be obedient to Allah, or to follow the desires and commit sins, wal-'iyadhu billah. And this is the next set of verses, which is verses 23 to 29 from the same surah. And Sheikh Ahmed, go ahead and recite for us, inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. وراودته التي هو في بيتها عن نفسه وغلقت الأبواب وقالت هيت لك قال معاذ الله إنه ربي أحسن مثواي إنه لا يفلح الظالمون ولقد همت به وهم بها لولا أن رأى برهان ربه كذلك لنصرف عنه السوء والفحشاء إنه من عبادنا المخلصين واستبق الباب وقدت قميصه من دبر وألف يا سيدها لدى الباب قالت ما جزاء من أراد بأهلك سوءا قالت ما جزاء من أراد بأهلك سوءا إلا أن يسجن أو عذاب أليم قال هي راودتني عن نفسي وشهد شاهد من أهلها إن كان قميصه قد من قبل فصدقت وهو من الكاذبين وإن كان قميصه قد من دبر فكذبت وهو من الصادقين فلما رأى قميصه قد من دبر قال إنه من كيدكن إن كيدكن عظيم يوسف أعرض عن هذا واستغفري لذنبك إنك كنت من الخاطئين.
MashaAllah, Jazakumullah khairan. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you. As we hear in these verses what happened to Yusuf alayhi salam when the wife of Al-Aziz, where he was raised in their household, when she tried to seduce him, and she took all the means to do so, and he is a young man and he is in being a slave. That means no one will go after him if he would follow what his master is wants from him. And being a stranger, which is different than someone that is resident in a place. So all of the means that would lead for him to fall into the sin, especially that he has the means and he has the desire. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protected him. And this is where he sought refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protected him because of his sincerity and his purity of intentions and how he was devoted in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when the details as mentioned where she ran after him when he was trying to escape from such a place, and the witness from her people when he saw that the garment of Yusuf alayhi salam was torn from the back and not from the front, which is a sign that she was not resisting, it comes from her, because that means he was fleeing, running, and she's the one that grabbed him from behind, and this is how his garment become torn. So when the matter become clear that this is not the fault of Yusuf alayhi salam, and when they saw this and when her husband saw that, and he said that this is from your plots, and indeed your plots is a major plot. And the plot here, as we see in the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, that she was the one in fault. She's the one that tried to cause Yusuf to fall into the major sin. And it ended up being Yusuf alayhi salam being in prison, as if he's the criminal and she's not. And this is how the plot, this evil plot that she did against Yusuf alayhi salam. And this is a major thing, of course, as we see. So this is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warns against the like of the wife of Al-Aziz, and for women to protect their chastity and their honor, and to stay away from plotting. As men they plot, women they plot. And this is something that is evil characteristics for a person to be upon. And when her husband, he said to Yusuf alayhi salam to stay away from this, do not say that to anyone. And he ordered his wife to seek forgiveness because of her sin, because she was in fault. And it shows or gives us a glimpse of how the environment that was present there, where people were weak status of al-iman, with faith, it's easy for them to fall into sins. And this is the environment that Yusuf alayhi salam was raised in, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him steadfastness upon the deen of Allah, which shows the importance of turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that gives steadfastness to matters of the deen, even if the environment around the person is not the best environment, especially when a person doesn't have a choice. So definitely to rely upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to be warned against all kinds of sins. And when people are close to one another, men and women, these types of sins can be easily occurring, and that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala set the rules in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ to separate for whatever means that can lead people to falling into sins. And that's why you would find the conduct of the believing men and women in such a way to protect them from the evil within their own selves, as we would see what happened in the story. We continue inshallah ta'ala with the next set of verses, and verses number 30 to verse number 34, and Shaykh Ayman, go ahead and recite for us inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. وقال نسوة في المدينة امرأة العزيز تراود فتاها عن نفسه قد شغفها حبا إنا لنراها في ضلال مبين. فلما سمعت بمكرهن أرسلت إليهن وأعتدت لهن متكأ وآتت كل واحدة منهن سكينا وقالت اخرج عليهن. فلما رأينه أكبرنه وقطعن أيديهن وقلن حاش لله ما هذا بشرا إن هذا إلا ملك كريم. قالت فذلكن الذي لمتنني فيه ولقد راودته عن نفسه فاستعصم. قالت فذلكن الذي لمتنني فيه ولقد راودته عن نفسه فاستعصم ولئن لم يفعل ما آمره ليسجنن وليكونن من الصاغرين. قال رب السجن أحب إلي مما يدعونني إليه وإلا تصرف عني كيدهن أصب إليهن. قال رب السجن أحب إلي مما يدعونني إليه وإلا تصرف عني كيدهن أصب إليهن وأكن من الجاهلين. فاستجاب له ربه فصرف عنه كيدهن إنه هو السميع العليم.
MashaAllah, barakallah feek. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you. So continuing with the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, and when this matter that we just heard got widespread in the town, and the women in the town, they heard of it. And the word niswa, as this is what women is, so they heard about this, which shows again, looking into the environment that Yusuf alayhi salam was in, environment with weak iman, where people are gossiping with one another, the women, they're not concerned about the purpose of their life, they're gossiping, they're following their desires. So they start talking about the wife of Al-Aziz, how in her status she's trying to seduce one of her slaves. So as if they wanted to see who is that person that she's falling into such a degrading level as a result of him. And she also, when she heard this, she brought them all and she prepared a gathering for all of them. And she asked Yusuf alayhi salam to come out for them to see him. And when they saw him, they realized that how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put so much beauty in him, as the Prophet alayhi wasallam, he said half of the beauty was given to Yusuf alayhi salam. And they said, this is not a human being, this is something like an angel or an honored one. So then she told them that this is what you blamed me of having the desire for. And then she made it very clear that if he does not follow what I command him to do, that he will be imprisoned and he will be among those who are belittled. And this is, again, you can imagine the test that Yusuf alayhi salam is going through. You know, when people are going through a test or a trial in their life, something that they don't want to do. You know, someone loses their wealth or being forced to do something. But this is something that would fit perfectly his desire. But because of the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he abstained from what they're calling him to do, which is how many people on the face of earth would pass such a trial and such a test. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned him in the Quran, that we recite till the day of judgment, of how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala elevated him and made him Al-Kareem, as we know that he's someone that honored by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be in such a noble state and noble characteristics. So that's why he said, and he made dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when she threatened him that he will be imprisoned if he does not fulfill what she's asking him to do. He said that prison is more beloved to me than what they're inviting me to do, which is committing sins and disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he led the matter to be to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, relying upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. And he asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that if he does not take away their plots from him, that he would follow their desires and he would be among the ignorant ones. So those who fall into the sins, they are ignorant ones. They're not really strong individuals, those who would endure patience to be obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepted what he asked for, and he pushed away from him their plots. So this is what, as mentioned before, that this plot, this kaid that they had upon Yusuf alayhi salam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only one that pushed it away from him. And if you look from a materialistic perspective, Yusuf alayhi salam, he lost. Why? Because he was imprisoned for years. He was in prison, which is to the people, this is a big loss. But to Yusuf alayhi salam, this is a win. This is a gain. Why? Because he was protected from the sins. And a sin that might take few minutes is far worse than time in prison that would take few years. Why? Because the obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the objective, is the purpose of this life. But since we're talking about women in the Quran, you see how this is one of the trials in this life. Women are tested by men, men are tested by women. And the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned this clearly, that I never left a fitna or a trial for men after me bigger than the fitna of women, meaning when it comes to disobeying Allah. So many sins that people fall in as a result of that relationship between men and women, whether it's fornication, adultery, and what comes before that, not lowering the gaze, and non-permissible relationships, so many. And those who are saved from this, and those who repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from such an evil thing, they are the true believers. They are the ones that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestowed His favor upon. And this is part of what's mentioned in the Quran for the admonition and the reminder for both men and women. For women to observe their hijab and their chastity and their modesty, and for men to lower their gaze and to be away from what would make them fall into sins. Wal-'iyadhu billah. So by having said that, and with still more verses in Surah Yusuf that we need to really reflect upon, but we'll do that inshallah ta'ala next time. And before we end, I would like to thank the reciters. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make our gatherings always the gatherings of the Quran and benefiting from the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
الله نزل أحسن الحديث كتابا متشابها مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم ثم تلين جلودهم وقلوبهم